Mafia. When mentioning this name, people immediately think of notorious gangs, bloody wars, and bosses who manipulate entire cities. But between the Chicago Mafia and the New York Mafia, which is truly the most terrifying force, one side is ruthless and unforgiving, controlling everything with guns and violence. The other is a sophisticated system, lurking in the shadows, influencing the economy and politics from behind the scenes. One rules through fear, the other controls everything without anyone realizing it. So, which model is stronger? If you were a mafia boss, which path would you choose? And is there truly any criminal organization that is immortal? New York and Chicago, two of America's biggest cities, two economic and cultural centers, and also two of the bloodiest battlegrounds for the most notorious mafia gangs of the 20th century. But they were not just ordinary criminal organizations. They were entire systems, underground societies with their own rules, politics, economy, and bosses who controlled the game. The Chicago Mafia, under Al Capone, was a relentless machine of violence, where power was asserted through machine guns and public assassinations. In contrast, the New York Mafia operated like a true underground empire, where bosses hid behind legitimate businesses, pulling the strings from the shadows. Two different models, two different paths, but what caused one to collapse quickly while the other continued to exist to this day? Let's go back to the 1920s, when Prohibition, 1920 to 1933, created a lucrative black market for criminal organizations. The U.S. alcohol ban did not reduce demand, it only fueled the rise of smuggling and illegal liquor production. The mafia quickly entered the game. From secret speakeasies and underground distilleries to vast distribution networks stretching across the country. This was the golden opportunity for the mafia to rise, and both Chicago and New York seized it. Chicago, where Al Capone built his empire, became a brutal battlefield for gangs. Purges happened constantly. Bosses were overthrown one after another, and only the strongest could survive. Al Capone was not only powerful but also ruthless and intelligent, knowing how to leverage both violence and political connections to expand his power. But there was a problem. Capone did not have a truly sustainable system. He was the center of everything, and that created a fatal weakness. Meanwhile, in New York, the mafia took a different route. No single boss dominated the city, instead, 5 mafia families shared power. The 5 families, Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo, did not just coexist, they established a strict set of rules ensuring that if one boss fell, the organization would continue operating without disruption. No one held absolute power, and no one was too prominent to become an easy target. This was the biggest difference between the two empires. Chicago may have had a great Capone, but New York had a system that could not be dismantled with a single arrest. This was the key factor that led to the vastly different fates of the two organizations. If the Chicago Mafia was like a snake that could be killed by cutting off its head, the New York Mafia was an octopus with multiple tentacles, cut one off, and another would grow in its place. Imagine yourself as a mafia boss. Which path would you choose? A system of violence, controlling everything through gun barrels, or an underground network where money and connections determine the winner? Was Capone's approach truly a mistake? Or was he simply a man of an era where violence was the only means of survival? This is the question we will continue to analyze. In 1929, an event completely changed the game in Chicago, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. One of the bloodiest purges in American mafia history. Al Capone decided to eliminate his biggest rival, Bugs Moran, with a plan of ruthless precision. Disguised as police officers, Capone's gunmen lured and slaughtered 6 key members of Moran's gang in broad daylight. No rules, no negotiations, just blood spilled on the floor. But Capone made a critical mistake. He was too public, too bold, and left the authorities no choice but to act. By this point, the US government no longer saw the mafia as just a local problem. It was now a national threat that needed to be eradicated. The FBI stepped in, and Capone became their #1 target. However, he was not arrested for murder. He was taken down for tax evasion. A man who built an empire with guns and blood was ultimately defeated by numbers on paper. This may sound ridiculous, but it revealed an important truth. Capone may have been great at controlling his gang, but he was not great at hiding himself from the law. This was an area where the New York Mafia was far superior. In New York, the Mafia continued to grow. They did not fight in the streets, they controlled labor unions, finance, construction, and even politics. When Capone was arrested, his empire crumbled within a few years. But when a New York boss was arrested, another would take his place without anyone noticing. The five families' decentralized structure allowed them to survive for decades. So in the end, which path was the right one? Was the Chicago Mafia stronger? Or was the New York Mafia more sophisticated? If Capone had not been arrested, could he have built a system as sustainable as the five families? And if the five families were so powerful, why did they start to decline by the late 20th century? These questions do not have easy answers. But one thing is certain. The Mafia does not die, it only changes the way it operates. If Chicago represents the Mafia's bloody past, then New York is its present and possibly its future. But can it last forever? In the next part, we will continue exploring what truly caused the downfall of the Chicago Mafia while the New York Mafia continued to thrive. Was violence truly a double-edged sword? Or were there other factors that determined the survival of an underground empire? The secrets of the Mafia world are far from over. Al Capone built an empire, but he was also the reason for its downfall. When Capone took control, he understood one thing: to dominate Chicago, he had to have complete control over the bootlegging market. And to do that, he needed an army ready to slaughter anyone who stood in his way. From 1925 to 1931, Chicago became a battlefield where the Tommy gun was the ultimate symbol of power. He didn't just eliminate rival gangs, he bribed the police, controlled the judicial system, and even had judges and politicians in his pocket. But no matter how powerful he was, he couldn't escape one unchanging rule: when an organization depends on a single individual, it collapses the moment that person is gone. Capone was too prominent. He appeared in newspapers, threw lavish parties, and lived like a king in a chaotic city. This made him an unavoidable target for the government. The FBI could ignore gangs that operated in the shadows, but not someone like Capone. His name spread across America, leading to his inevitable downfall. But the deeper reason for his failure was that he had no strong system of succession. When Capone was arrested for tax evasion in 1931, his empire couldn't sustain itself. Those who remained were either eliminated or lost control of the city. Chicago, once a mafia kingdom, quickly became an empty battlefield where small criminal groups fought for power. But none could replace Capone's position. Meanwhile, in New York, things were entirely different. There was no single king like Capone. There was an organized and structured mafia system. The five families did not need a public leader because each family had its own boss, operated under strict principles, and shared power. This was why, even when the FBI arrested a mafia boss, the system continued running as usual. When John Gotti was arrested in 1992, the Gambino family didn't collapse. When Vincent Gigante was imprisoned, the Genovese family kept operating. There was no central figure, there was an entire organization behind the scenes. The biggest difference between Chicago and New York was how each adapted to circumstances. Chicago relied on violence to control the market, but that was a double-edged sword. Violence allowed Capone to crush his rivals, but it also made him a target for law enforcement. New York, on the other hand, operated differently. The five families controlled labor unions, manipulated the real estate market, and infiltrated legitimate industries. They didn't need to shoot people in the streets to prove their power. They simply controlled the economy, making them untouchable for a long time. But no system is perfect. When the FBI realized that the New York Mafia had infiltrated every corner of society, they launched a new war. In 1985, the RICO Act was fully utilized, allowing the government to prosecute entire mafia organizations instead of just individual members. This was a devastating blow. And while the five families didn't collapse overnight, they gradually weakened over time. Today, the five families no longer hold the same power as before, but they still exist in the shadows. So the question remains, If the Chicago Mafia failed due to excessive violence and a lack of succession, can the New York Mafia survive forever because of its sophistication? Or will it eventually follow Chicago's path, just at a slower pace? This remains a topic of debate among criminologists to this day. If the five families have survived for decades, does that mean they are immortal? Or has the government simply not yet found a way to eradicate them completely? These questions will be explored in the next part, as we delve deeper into how the five families have adapted to the modern era and why, despite constant pressure from the FBI, they have never fully disappeared. The Chicago Mafia collapsed, but the New York Mafia still stands. Have they discovered the secret to eternal survival? Chicago collapsed, but New York remained standing, not because they were stronger, but because they knew how to adapt. If the Chicago Mafia was a blazing fire that burned intensely and then faded, the New York Mafia was like an underground current, flowing through every corner of society. Impossible to eliminate easily. But does that mean they are immortal? In 1985, the FBI decided that the five families could no longer be allowed to control New York. This was the moment when the US government realized that the Mafia was no longer just a street gang. It had become a part of the American economy. They were not just running illegal gambling dens or betting rings. They controlled labor unions, manipulated the construction industry, and even held influence over politics. And when that happened, the FBI knew that if they didn't act now, the Mafia would never be stopped. Operation RICO was launched, and for the first time in history, the US government could prosecute not just individual criminals but entire organized crime syndicates. This completely changed the game. In the past, the FBI could only arrest a few hitmen or low-level enforcers. But now they could dismantle an entire crime family. Former Mafia bosses like Paul Castellano, Tony Salerno, and Carmen Persico were arrested and sentenced. It seemed like the New York Mafia was on the brink of extinction. But then something unexpected happened. The five families did not collapse. When one boss was arrested, another took his place. When one gang was dismantled, another took over operations. Because the five families were not dependent on a single individual, they were a system. And that system had existed for decades. This made it incredibly difficult for the FBI to completely wipe out the New York Mafia. Yet, nothing is invincible. Although the five families did not completely fall apart, they began to weaken after Operation RICO. By the 1990s, the New York Mafia no longer controlled the city as it once did. Lucrative construction contracts were more tightly regulated by the government. Labor unions were no longer easily manipulated. And most importantly, the Mafia no longer had the same level of intelligent and disciplined leadership as in previous generations. One thing often overlooked: the New York Mafia did not die because of FBI crackdowns. It was ultimately undone from within. When the old generation of bosses was imprisoned, the new generation failed to uphold the sacred code of omerta, the Mafia's code of silence. Those who were once willing to die for the organization now turned into informants to reduce their prison sentences. This betrayal from within was what truly crippled the Mafia. Does this mean the New York Mafia has truly disappeared? Not exactly. While they are no longer as powerful as before, they still exist in the shadows, adapting to the modern world. In the past, they made money from bootlegging, gambling, and extortion. Today, they have shifted to less detectable activities: financial fraud, technology crimes, money laundering through cryptocurrencies, and even investments in the stock market. But even as they adapt to the modern world, the five families are no longer the dominant force in organized crime. In recent years, they have been overshadowed by new criminal organizations, Mexican drug cartels, the Russian Mafia, and Asian gangs like the Triads and Yakuza. These groups are not only more brutal but also operate with a level of sophistication that rivals the New York Mafia. So the question remains: if the New York Mafia has weakened, who will replace them? Can the five families reclaim their power? Or will they eventually be replaced by newer organizations? And most importantly, if the FBI has never been able to fully eradicate the Mafia, does that mean the government only seeks to control them rather than eliminate them completely? In the next part, We will dive deeper into how organized crime has evolved in the 21st century and whether these new criminal syndicates can learn from the mistakes of Chicago and New York to build an empire that is truly untouchable. The mafia may change, but the underworld will always exist. The mafia doesn't die, it only changes the way it operates. If the 20th century saw the explosive rise of the Chicago Mafia and the dominance of the five families in New York, the 21st century has witnessed the terrifying evolution of the underworld. No more bloody street wars. No more daytime shootouts. But that doesn't mean the mafia has disappeared. On the contrary, it has become more sophisticated, harder to detect, and perhaps more dangerous than ever. The New York Mafia once controlled everything, from bars and casinos to labor unions and even politicians in Congress. But when the FBI tightened its grip and former bosses were sent to prison, the mafia had to find a new path. They could no longer operate the old way. They had to adapt or be destroyed. And so, they evolved. In recent years, the mafia has moved beyond traditional extortion and racketeering. They have infiltrated legitimate industries, real estate, finance, banking, even technology. If in the past, the mafia was merely the group collecting protection money from a casino, today, they are the ones behind multi-million-dollar investment firms and real estate empires. No longer do we see flashy figures like John Gotti strolling through the streets. But that doesn't mean they no longer exist. Even more dangerously, they have perfected the art of money laundering. In the past, laundering money meant running a bar, a restaurant, or a casino and reporting fake revenues to legitimize illicit funds. Today, the mafia has gone far beyond that. They use cryptocurrency, shell companies, and virtual transactions to turn dirty money into clean assets. They invest in the stock market, manipulate stock prices, and exploit loopholes in the financial system to continue operating without leaving a trace. But that doesn't mean the mafia is invulnerable. In reality, even as they have evolved, they are no longer the only major force in the criminal underworld. If the Italian Mafia was the most powerful criminal organization in America from the 1950s to the 1980s, by the 21st century, they have been overshadowed by other syndicates. The Mexican drug cartels, the Russian Mafia, and Asian crime syndicates like the Triads and Yakuza have all taken over territories once controlled by the New York Mafia. Mexican cartels, with their vast drug supply networks and global distribution chains, have become the #1 force in narcotics trafficking. They do not need to hide like the Italian Mafia because they control their own territories, command private armies, and are willing to confront governments directly. While the New York Mafia must operate in the shadows, the Mexican cartels function openly with the power of an underground state. The Russian Mafia, with its influence over energy industries and high-tech sectors, has also expanded its reach. They do not rely on brute force like the Italian Mafia but instead use sophisticated corruption networks, infiltrating governments and international banks. If the five families once ruled New York by controlling labor unions, the Russian Mafia manipulates the global economy by influencing entire political systems. So where does the Italian Mafia stand in the modern world? They still exist, but they are no longer the dominant force. The five families continue to operate, but on a smaller and more discreet scale. They cannot openly challenge the FBI, nor can they return to the violent tactics of their golden age. But that does not mean they are finished. They are searching for a way to reclaim power, and their only chance of survival is to adapt to the new game. The mafia of the 21st century is no longer made up of street thugs with guns. It is run by individuals in suits, managing an underground financial empire. They no longer control just a neighborhood or a city, they influence international corporations. They are no longer confined to one country. They can operate from anywhere with an anonymous digital footprint. So, the biggest question remains: if the mafia has evolved to become almost unrecognizable, can the FBI still eliminate them? Or is it possible that the government can only regulate them rather than completely destroy them? And if the five families are no longer the dominant force, will another criminal organization rise to take their place? The answers to these questions are not simple. The criminal underworld has never stopped evolving, and every time one organization falls, another rises to take its place. The mafia may have changed, but its nature remains the same. And that means that, in one form or another, the underworld will always exist. In the next section, we will explore the ultimate question: can a criminal organization ever be truly immortal? If the 5 families have survived decades of FBI crackdowns, does that mean they have found the formula for survival? Or is it simply a matter of time before they, too, are replaced? The New York Mafia survived the 20th century, but can it survive the 21st? The Chicago Mafia has fallen. The New York Mafia still survives. But the underworld never stops moving. When one empire crumbles, another rises to take its place. So, in the 21st century, who holds the power? Has the Italian Mafia truly faded into obscurity? Or are they merely waiting for the right moment to return? And most importantly, does the government really want to eliminate the Mafia? Or simply control it? If you have an answer, share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss more fascinating stories from the world of organized crime.